So talk 5, Quarreling Monks. So it's very easy for us to think how wonderful it must have been to have access to the actual living Buddha, to be able to be in his presence, to think how different it must have been to be part of the community back then. But when we look at some of the stories from those times, we begin to realise it wasn't always such a rosy picture, and that at times the Buddha really had his work cut out dealing with the difficulties that arose between his disciples. At first sight, it seems ridiculous. How could that be possible? How could the Buddha's work for humanity have been endangered by often petty concerns? But maybe we don't have to actually look that far for an answer. We just have to look into our own hearts and minds and the small hurts and grievances that we often harbour and feed if we're going to really begin to understand how that might have happened. So this is the story of the quarrel between the monks, the bhikkhus at Kosambian, which erupted about 10 years after the Buddha's enlightenment and threatened to become the first major schism in his rapidly growing community of disciples. And it all began, would you believe it, with a pot of water left behind in a latrine, an essential thing in an age and culture without toilet paper. So things had grown quickly, and the community of monks had begun to be more organised. The more experienced monks took on specific responsibilities. The senior bhikkhu who left the pot of water in the latrine was an expert on the doctrine. So any younger monks with questions about the teaching would have been referred to him. The monk who came next to the latrine and found the pot of water was an expert on the Vinaya, on the rules of monastic life. So some of these rules were of real spiritual importance, but others were simply to do with how living in community was organised. So not leaving a pot of water in the latrine was just a matter of hygiene and consideration for others. The master on the Vinaya spoke later to the master of the doctrine. Did you realise that it's an offence against the rules to leave a water pot in the latrine? I'm sorry, I didn't know that, responded the master of the teaching. I guess new rules were emerging and it may have been difficult to keep up with them all. All right, if you didn't realise, it's not an offence, but now you know. This might have been the end of the matter, but the master of the Vinaya went back and told his disciples, "What do you think? That master of the doctrine broke the rules. He committed an offence and he didn't even know it." His disciples told the disciples of the master of the doctrine what had been said, and very quickly word got back to the master of doctrine himself. "But he told me that if I hadn't known it was against the rules, it wasn't an offence. Now he's contradicting himself. The man's a liar." This, in turn, was reported back. "He says your preceptor is a liar." "Oh, calling me a liar, is he? We'll soon see about that." So the master of the Vinaya, of the discipline, called together a chapter and suspended the master of the doctrine from the order. But the master of the doctrine was well known and much respected. He argued that he'd been unjustly suspended and rallied wide support. His supporters went to those who'd suspended him and argued that the suspension was completely unjust. But they wouldn't hear it. They insisted it had to stand. So both sides sought together wider support, and the arguments grew stronger. So word of what was going on was brought to the Buddha. So he came and visited, spoke with both sides, and urged them to soften the hardness of their positions and come into communication. But as soon as he was gone, the positions just hardened again. Things went from bad to worse. Quarrels, brawls and disputes broke out in the midst of the community, and bhikkhus wounded each other with verbal arrows. Hearing how things were going, the Buddha again came to the quarreling monks and said to them, "Enough, bhikkhus, enough. No quarrelling, no brawling, no wrangling, no disputing." But a monk spoke up, saying, the Buddha should not trouble himself. He should just go and enjoy a peaceful time. He should just leave it to us to sort this all out. The Buddha tried twice more, but got the same response. Just leave it to us. We'll sort this out. And he thought, these misguided men are obsessed. They refuse to hear sense. So he got up and left. The quarrelling went on. When the layfolk in Kosambian began to hear of what was happening, they became very upset. They heard that the monks had actually refused to even listen to the Buddha himself and just remained completely embroiled in their quarrels. So now when the monks went to beg their food, they found themselves shunned. No one would give them food. And with their begging bowls and their stomachs empty, they began to come to their senses. But it took empty stomachs to start to bring them round. They decided to go to Savatthi, where the Buddha was staying, and see him. When the followers of the Buddha in Savatthi heard that the troublesome Kosambian monks were coming to Savatthi, they weren't at all happy. They'd rather not have anything to do with them, and they asked the Buddha how to receive them. But he encouraged his disciples to receive them politely, to give them food, to give them 2 separate places to stay in quiet seclusion so they could reflect on what was going on. Gradually the heat of anger subsided. Both sides started to get some perspective on what had happened. The master of doctrine swallowed his pride, acknowledged his fault, accepted his suspension, and humbly asked to be reinstated. The master of the Vinaya of the rules acknowledged his own hastiness and unskillfulness. A friendly settlement was made and the 2 sides were reconciled. The community of monks was once more at peace, but it was a sobering episode. And we can recall the words of the Buddha recorded in the Dhammapada that are sometimes connected with this actual incident. Those who entertain such thoughts as he robbed me, he beat me, he conquered me, he robbed me, they will not still their hatred. Those who do not entertain such thoughts as he abused me, he beat me, he conquered me, he robbed me, they will still their hatred. not by hatred. Are hatreds ever pacified here in the world? They are pacified by love. This is the eternal law. Others do not realize that we are all heading for death. Those who do will compose their quarrel.